The abandoned plantation house sat silent on the Alabama river bluff for 3 weeks before anyone dared approach its front door. Inside, the dining room table was still set for breakfast. Cold coffee in porcelain cups, flies circling a bowl of congealed grits. 7 chairs pulled back as if the occupants had stood suddenly and never returned. In the master bedroom upstairs, a leather journal lay open on the writing desk. The final entry dated September 9th, 1857. They are watching us now from the quarters. I see it in their eyes. Thomas has disappeared. I fear we have miscalculated everything. The house belonged to the Wardlow family, one of the wealthiest in Wilcox County. By September 23rd, the Wardlows were gone. So were the Marshalls from the adjacent property, the Hendersons across the river, the Prices, the Caulfields, the Brabants. 7 plantation families in 6 counties, all fled between August and November of 1857, leaving behind land, equipment, and in some cases, their own dead. Moss Creek Plantation occupied 1,100 acres of bottomland, where the Alabama River curved through Wilcox County like a question mark. The soil was black and thick, the kind that stuck to boot heels and held cotton roots deep. In August of 1857, it supported 217 enslaved people who worked the fields from first light until their shadows stretched longer than their bodies. The plantation house was a Greek revival structure with 6 white columns and a widow's walk where Catherine Wardlow liked to stand in the evenings, watching the river turn copper in the setting sun. Her husband, Montgomery Wardlow, had built the house in 1842 with profits from 3 consecutive record cotton harvests. He had hung a brass bell on the front porch that rang for meals, for emergencies, for the start and end of each workday. The bell's voice carried across the fields and into the quarters, a constant reminder of who commanded time itself. Montgomery was 48 years old that August, a tall man with graying temples and hands that had never touched a cotton boll. He managed the plantation from a mahogany desk in his study, keeping ledgers that tracked every bale, every bushel, every dollar spent and earned. He owned 142 people outright and leased 75 more from his brother-in-law during harvest season. The leased workers came from a plantation in Montgomery County, arriving in July and departing in November. Strangers who disrupted the careful social order Montgomery believed he had established. Among the leased workers in 1857 was a man named Thomas. He was 26 years old, born on a tobacco farm in Virginia, sold south at age 12 when his first owner died bankrupt. Thomas had spent 14 years moving between plantations, never staying longer than a single season, never forming attachments that could be weaponized against him. He was quiet, literate in secret, and patient in ways that made older men nervous. Thomas arrived at Moss Creek on July 3rd with the other leased workers, 75 people who stepped off a barge at the plantation dock, carrying nothing but the clothes they wore. Montgomery's overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Haynes, separated them by skill. Field hands to the quarters, carpenters to the workshop. Thomas, who claimed experience with horses, was assigned to the stables. The stables sat behind the main house, 8 stalls that held Montgomery's riding horses and the 2 carriage horses Catherine preferred. Thomas worked alongside Jacob, an enslaved man who had been at Moss Creek for 19 years and knew every animal by temperament. Jacob was suspicious of Thomas at first. Seasonal workers often stole tools or food, trying to improve their situations before being sent back to their home plantations. But Thomas worked quietly, asked few questions, and shared the cornbread he received from the kitchen without complaint. By mid-August, Jacob had begun to trust him. They spoke in the evenings after the horses were fed, sitting on overturned buckets in the stable yard, while bats hunted insects above the river. Thomas asked about the plantation's layout, about Montgomery's habits, about which overseers were cruel and which were merely indifferent. Jacob answered honestly, seeing no harm in helping another man navigate a temporary situation. What Jacob didn't know was that Thomas had been asking the same questions at every plantation where he had worked over the past 14 years. He was collecting information the way some men collected coins, storing details about overseers' schedules, about masters who drank heavily, about houses with poor locks and families who slept soundly. Thomas was building a map of vulnerability, waiting for the right moment to use it. That moment arrived on August 17th. Montgomery Wardlow disappeared between midnight and dawn on August 18, 1857. His wife Catherine woke at 6 to find his side of the bed cold and undisturbed. His riding boots were missing from the bedroom. His hat was gone from its peg by the front door. The pistol he kept in his desk drawer had vanished. Catherine rang the brass bell. Virgil Haynes came running from the overseer's cottage, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders. Together they searched the house, calling Montgomery's name through empty rooms that smelled of beeswax and last night's dinner. They found nothing disturbed except the study window, which stood open despite the previous evening's rain. Haynes organized a search. 20 men fanned across the plantation grounds, checking the gin house, the barn, the workshops, the quarters. By noon, they had found Montgomery's hat floating in a livestock pond near the north property line. By 3 o'clock, they had found his pistol wedged between two rocks at the river's edge, the barrel still loaded. They never found Montgomery Wardlow. Catherine sent riders to the neighboring plantations and into town. She offered a reward of $500 for information. She waited 3 days before contacting the county sheriff, a cautious man named Thaddeus Boone, who had known Montgomery since both were boys. Boone brought 6 deputies and spent a week interviewing everyone on the property. The enslaved people offered nothing useful. They had been asleep in the quarters. They had heard nothing. They had seen nothing. Montgomery was a good master, they told the sheriff, fair and Christian. His disappearance was a mystery and a tragedy. The white staff were equally unhelpful. Virgil Haynes had been in his cottage with his wife. The housekeeper had been visiting her sister in Selma. The cook had gone to bed early with a headache. Everyone had alibis that couldn't be proven or disproven. Sheriff Boone examined the open study window and found fresh scratches in the paint, where it appeared to have been pried from outside. He found boot prints in the mud below, but rain had blurred them beyond identification. He concluded that Montgomery had either been murdered by an intruder or had fled some personal crisis, possibly debt or scandal. Either way, Boone lacked evidence to pursue charges. Catherine buried an empty coffin on September 1st in the family plot behind the house. The service was brief. 17 neighbors attended, standing in humid sunshine while a circuit preacher read from Psalms. Catherine wore black and accepted condolences with dry eyes, already calculating how to maintain the plantation until Montgomery's will cleared probate. What Catherine didn't know was that Montgomery's body was 15 feet underground, sealed in a storm cellar that had been dug in 1838 to store root vegetables during tornado season. The cellar's entrance was hidden beneath a false floor in one of the slave cabins in the back row of the quarters, a cabin that housed 6 field hands who had lived there for over a decade without ever noticing the concealed hatch. Thomas had found it in his 3rd week at Moss Creek. He had been asking Jacob about the plantation's history, about old structures that might still be usable, and Jacob had mentioned the storm cellars some planters built before the war with the Creeks. Thomas had spent his evenings searching, moving methodically through the quarters while others slept, until he found the hatch beneath rotting floorboards in cabin 17. The cellar was 8 feet deep and 12 feet square, accessible by a wooden ladder. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of clay and mildew. Thomas had cleaned it out over several nights, removing the remains of pottery jars and moldering baskets. He had tested the ladder, reinforced weak rungs, and confirmed that the hatch could be lowered silently from below. Montgomery had been drunk when Thomas intercepted him on the path between the main house and the stables. It was just past midnight on August 18th, and Montgomery was walking unsteadily, singing something under his breath. Thomas appeared from behind a magnolia tree, startling Montgomery into silence. "Mr. Wardlow," Thomas had said quietly, "something's wrong with your carriage horse. I think you should see." Montgomery had followed Thomas to the stables, where nothing was wrong with any horse. By the time Montgomery realized the deception, Thomas had struck him twice with a hammer borrowed from the carpentry shop. Montgomery fell without crying out, his skull fractured in 2 places. Thomas dragged him to cabin 17, lowered him through the hatch, and climbed down after him. Montgomery died in the cellar sometime before dawn. Thomas sat with him, waiting, listening to Montgomery's breathing become wet and irregular before finally stopping altogether. When it was finished, Thomas climbed out, replaced the hatch, and returned the hammer to the workshop. He was in the stable yard at sunrise, feeding horses as if nothing had happened. 7 people knew what Thomas had done. They had watched from their cabins as he dragged Montgomery's body across the yard. They had heard the hatch creak open and the ladder's rungs groan under Montgomery's weight. They said nothing to the searchers. They said nothing to the sheriff. They said nothing to Catherine. They simply waited to see what would happen next. News of Montgomery Wardlow's disappearance reached the Marshall plantation on August 19th through a field hand who had a cousin at Moss Creek. The Marshall place sat 3 miles downriver, 900 acres of cotton and corn worked by 163 enslaved people. Edward Marshall heard the news at breakfast and rode immediately to offer Catherine Wardlow his assistance. Edward was 52. A widower who had managed his plantation alone since his wife died of typhoid in 1853. He was known throughout Wilcox County as a practical man, neither cruel nor sentimental, who believed that firm discipline and adequate provisions kept workers productive. He had never whipped anyone to death. He had never separated young children from their mothers. He considered himself a progressive planter. Catherine accepted Edward's help gratefully. She needed someone to oversee the harvest preparations, while Sheriff Boone conducted his investigation. Edward agreed to split his time between the 2 plantations, riding between them twice daily to ensure both operations continued smoothly. This arrangement lasted 11 days. On September 1st, Edward Marshall vanished from his own plantation between morning rounds and the midday meal. His horse was found grazing near the cotton gin, still saddled. His hat lay in the dirt nearby, as if it had fallen from his head. His pocket watch, engraved with his initials, was discovered 3 days later by a child fishing in the river. The crystal cracked, but the mechanism still ticking. Edward Marshall was never seen again. The county descended into nervous speculation. 2 prominent planters disappearing within 2 weeks suggested a pattern. Sheriff Boone expanded his investigation, interviewing merchants in town who might have sold passage to fugitives, checking with postmasters for suspicious correspondence, questioning every stranger who had passed through the county in recent months. He found nothing conclusive. What Boone didn't investigate were the enslaved populations of either plantation. The idea that bondspeople might have agency in these disappearances was literally unthinkable to Boone, a man who had grown up believing that enslaved people were fundamentally incapable of organized resistance. He questioned them, yes, but only as potential witnesses, never as suspects. This blindness was calculated. Thomas had relied on it. Edward Marshall had died in a cotton gin on his own property. The gin was a massive wooden structure housing machinery that separated cotton fiber from seed, dangerous equipment that could crush bones or sever limbs if mishandled. The gin operated during harvest season, silent the rest of the year, a building that workers avoided when it wasn't actively running. Thomas had been leased to the Marshall plantation for 3 days in late August to help repair storm damage to a barn. He had used those 3 days to explore the property, noting that Edward made predictable rounds every morning, always walking the same paths, always checking the same buildings. Thomas had also noted that the cotton gin had a back entrance that couldn't be seen from the main house. On September 1st, Thomas had hidden in the gin before dawn, waiting in the machinery's shadows while Edward completed his morning inspection. When Edward entered alone, Thomas had called out that he heard rats in the equipment. Edward had approached to investigate. Thomas had struck him once with a length of pipe, then activated the gin's machinery. The gin ran for 11 seconds before Thomas shut it down. Edward Marshall's body was unrecognizable, crushed and pulled into mechanical components designed to process hundreds of pounds of raw cotton. Thomas used a shovel to gather what remained and scattered it across a fallow field, mixing human tissue with soil and plant matter until the components were indistinguishable. 4 people had watched from the gin's windows. They said nothing to the searchers. They said nothing to the sheriff. The Marshall plantation sold at auction 6 weeks later. Edward's distant cousins in Charleston liquidated the estate rather than move to Wilcox County themselves. The 163 enslaved people were dispersed to 9 different buyers across Alabama and Mississippi. Thomas was already gone by then, returned to his home plantation in Montgomery County at the end of harvest season, his contract with the leasing system fulfilled. Behind him, he left 2 dead plantation owners and a growing terror among the white families of Wilcox County. A question nobody wanted to ask aloud: who would be next? The Henderson plantation occupied a river island in Marengo County, accessible only by ferry or a narrow bridge that washed out every spring. Jeremiah Henderson had chosen the location deliberately in 1846, believing that isolation offered security. An island, he reasoned, was easier to defend than mainland property. Workers couldn't simply walk away. Visitors had to announce themselves. By September of 1857, that isolation had become a trap. Jeremiah was 41 years old, a thin man with a persistent cough who managed 108 enslaved people with the help of his 2 sons, Marcus and William. The Henderson family lived in a modest 2-story house at the island's center, surrounded by cotton fields that produced adequate but not exceptional yields. Jeremiah supplemented his income by operating the ferry, charging neighboring planters a toll to cross the river. The Henderson family learned about the Wardlow and Marshall disappearances when a ferryman brought newspapers from Selma on September 7th. Jeremiah read the accounts with growing unease. He knew both families. Montgomery Wardlow had purchased seed from him the previous spring. Edward Marshall had loaned him a surveyor's chain the year before. That evening, Jeremiah gathered his sons in the study and made 2 decisions. First, they would increase security, keeping loaded shotguns in every room and maintaining watch schedules through the night. Second, they would reduce the enslaved population by selling 20 people, eliminating anyone who seemed sullen or uncooperative. The sales were conducted on September 14th. A trader from Mobil arrived with cash and left with 20 people, including 3 family groups and 2 skilled carpenters. The remaining 88 watched their companions cross the bridge in chains, disappearing toward the mainland and an uncertain future. Among those remaining was a woman named Rachel. She was 34 years old, born on the island, mother to 5 children whose fathers had been sold away years earlier. Rachel worked in the Henderson house as a cook and housekeeper, moving through rooms with practiced invisibility, hearing conversations the White family assumed she didn't understand. She had heard Jeremiah's plans. She had watched the 20 people cross the bridge. She had seen her own daughter, 14-year-old Sarah, nearly included in the sale before Jeremiah decided she was too young to bring good value. Rachel made her decision that night. The Henderson house had a kitchen separate from the main structure, connected by a covered walkway. This was standard in plantation architecture, designed to keep cooking heat and fire risk away from living quarters. Rachel prepared all meals in that kitchen, using a large brick hearth and a cast-iron stove Jeremiah had purchased in 1852. On the out. September 18th, Rachel prepared the evening meal as usual. Fried chicken, rice, greens, cornbread. She set the table in the dining room, placing the chicken platter in front of Jeremiah's seat, the rice bowl near Marcus, the greens beside William. She served them coffee in porcelain cups, sweetened with sugar and lightened with cream. Then she returned to the kitchen and waited. The poison was oleander, extracted from the decorative bushes that grew around the main house. Rachel had been collecting leaves for 3 weeks, boiling them down into a concentrated syrup using a method her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. Oleander produced a substance that stopped hearts, usually within a few hours of ingestion. Rachel had mixed the syrup into the coffee. Jeremiah Henderson died at 9:37 p.m., clutching his chest in the study where he had planned to sell her daughter. Marcus collapsed in the hallway outside his bedroom at 9:52. William made it as far as the front porch before his heart simply stopped at 10:06. Rachel found them in the order they had fallen. She checked for breathing, confirmed they were dead, then walked calmly to the quarters and told the other 88 people what she had done. The island erupted in controlled chaos. Some wanted to flee immediately, to take the ferry and disappear into Alabama's interior before anyone discovered the bodies. Others argued for burning everything, destroying the plantation so thoroughly that no one could rebuild. Rachel listened to both factions, then offered a third option. They would make it look like suicide. Working through the night, they arranged the scene. They moved Jeremiah to his study and placed his pistol in his hand, firing one shot through the ceiling to create powder burns. They positioned Marcus and William as if they had died trying to reach their father. They scattered Jeremiah's financial ledgers across the desk, highlighting debts and failed investments that might suggest despair. By dawn, the island told a story of a man overwhelmed by financial ruin who had killed his sons before taking his own life. The ferry operator discovered the bodies on September 19th, when no one came to lower the ferry cable at the usual morning hour. He crossed on foot using the bridge, found the Henderson family dead, and rode immediately to alert the sheriff in Linden. The investigation lasted 2 days. The sheriff, a man named Cotton Reeves who had known Jeremiah since boyhood, accepted the suicide narrative without serious question. The deaths were real. The powder burns on Jeremiah's hand were consistent with self-infliction. The timing made sense given the financial pressures facing many planters that year. Rachel was questioned as a matter of procedure. She wept appropriately. She claimed to have been in the quarters all evening. She suggested that Mr. Henderson had seemed troubled lately, distracted and short-tempered. Sheriff Reeves thanked her for her cooperation and moved on. The Henderson plantation was sold at auction in November. The 88 remaining enslaved people were dispersed across 4 counties. Rachel and her daughter Sarah were purchased together by a merchant from Demopolis who needed domestic staff. They worked in his household for 3 years before Rachel died of pneumonia in 1860. She never spoke of what she had done. Neither did the 87 people who had helped her arrange the scene. The Henderson deaths joined the Wardlow and Marshall disappearances in the collective anxiety spreading through Alabama's planter class. 3 prominent families destroyed in 6 weeks. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, even if its true nature remained hidden. In Greene County, 60 miles northwest of Wilcox, Nathaniel Price read about the Henderson tragedy with academic interest. Nathaniel was 36 years old, educated at the College of William and Mary, and convinced that scientific management could solve the problems plaguing Southern agriculture. He maintained detailed records of every aspect of his plantation's operations, from soil chemistry to worker productivity, believing that rational analysis would reveal optimal methods. Nathaniel owned 79 people who worked 540 acres of cotton and vegetables. His plantation was smaller than the Wardlow or Marshall estates, but more efficiently organized. Nathaniel had implemented a task system rather than gang labor, allowing workers to finish their daily assignments at their own pace. Those who completed tasks early received small rewards, extra rations, Sunday visiting privileges, occasional coins. Nathaniel considered this progressive management. His workers considered it a slightly more comfortable cage. Among the 79 was a man named Elijah, 42 years old, who had been at the Price plantation since childhood. Elijah was literate, having been taught to read by Nathaniel's father, who believed that skilled workers needed basic education to follow written instructions. Elijah managed the plantation's carpentry shop, overseeing repairs and construction projects with minimal supervision. Nathaniel trusted Elijah in ways he would never trust field workers. He gave Elijah keys to the workshop and tool sheds. He allowed Elijah to requisition materials from suppliers in town. He sometimes discussed plantation business with Elijah, treating him almost as a junior manager rather than property. This trust was Nathaniel's fatal miscalculation. Elijah had been reading the newspapers Nathaniel discarded. He knew about Wardlow, Marshall, and Henderson. He recognized the pattern even if white authorities didn't. Plantation owners were dying, and the deaths clustered in a specific region during a specific time period. This wasn't random violence. This was coordinated. Elijah began preparing in late September. The carpentry shop contained everything necessary to build a coffin. Elijah constructed one during the last week of September, working openly, telling anyone who asked that Nathaniel had commissioned it for an elderly field hand who was expected to die soon. The coffin was well made, pine boards joined with precision, interior lined with cotton batting. Nobody questioned it. On October 3rd, Elijah invited Nathaniel to the workshop to inspect some furniture he had been building. Nathaniel came alone at 4:30 in the afternoon, as he often did, enjoying these moments when he could discuss craftsmanship with someone who appreciated quality work. Elijah showed him the furniture, accepted Nathaniel's compliments, then offered to demonstrate a new joinery technique he had developed. Would Nathaniel like to see? Nathaniel would. Elijah asked Nathaniel to hold a board steady while he made a cut. Nathaniel bent over the workbench, gripping the board with both hands. Elijah struck him with a mallet, a single blow to the base of the skull that killed Nathaniel instantly. Elijah lowered Nathaniel's body into the coffin. He sealed the lid with the same precision he applied to all his work. Then he carried the coffin to the burial ground where enslaved people were interred, a section of the property separated from the white cemetery by a wall of oleander bushes. 3 men were waiting. They had already dug a grave in a corner of the burial ground, a plot supposedly reserved for the elderly field hand Elijah had mentioned weeks earlier. They lowered the coffin, filled the grave, and planted a rough wooden marker with the field hand's name. The field hand himself, confused but cooperative, was hidden in a cabin for 3 days before being quietly moved to a different plantation through an informal network that moved people between properties without official bills of sale. Nathaniel Price's disappearance was reported on October 4th when he failed to appear for dinner. His wife Amanda organized searches that found nothing. Sheriff's deputies from Utah spent a week investigating, interviewing workers who unanimously claimed ignorance. Elijah expressed particular concern, noting that Mr. Price had seemed distracted lately, perhaps troubled by the news from Wilcox and Marengo counties. Maybe, Elijah suggested gently, Mr. Price had decided to leave Alabama, to start fresh somewhere safer. The deputies found this theory plausible. They noted Nathaniel's progressive management style, his outsider education, his sometimes radical ideas about crop rotation and soil chemistry. Perhaps he had indeed fled, unable to cope with the traditional violence of plantation life. Amanda Price never accepted this explanation. She insisted Nathaniel would never abandon her and their 2 children. She hired a private investigator from Mobile who spent 3 months pursuing leads that went nowhere. Eventually, financial necessity forced her to sell the plantation. The 79 enslaved people were sold at auction in January of 1858. Elijah was purchased by a mill owner in Tuscaloosa who needed a skilled carpenter. He lived another 23 years, dying of natural causes in 1881. On his deathbed, surrounded by family he had been able to raise in freedom after emancipation, he told his grandson a story about building the finest coffin he had ever made. He didn't explain who had been buried in it. Reverend Thomas Caulfield stood in his church in Dallas County on the 2nd Sunday of October, 1857, and delivered a sermon about the mysterious troubles afflicting their region. 4 plantation families destroyed or displaced in 10 weeks. The godly suffering alongside the wicked, he intoned, was a test of faith. Caulfield was 49 years old, pastor of a Baptist congregation that included most of the prominent planters in Dallas County. He was also the owner of 32 enslaved people who worked a small plantation adjacent to the church property. Caulfield saw no contradiction between Christian ministry and slaveholding. Scripture clearly endorsed the institution he believed, and his ownership was benevolent, focused on saving souls as well as profiting from labor. His congregation that morning included 14 plantation families, all of them frightened by recent events, all seeking reassurance that their world wasn't collapsing. Caulfield gave them what they needed, affirmation that their social order was divinely ordained, that these troubles were temporary, that faith and vigilance would see them through. After the service, during a fellowship meal on the church grounds, the planters discussed practical security measures. More patrols, stricter curfews, reduced privileges for workers who seemed unreliable. Several suggested selling off any enslaved people from Virginia or the Carolinas, outsiders who might bring dangerous ideas. One man, a planter named Howard Brabant, proposed something more extreme. He suggested that all plantation owners in Dallas County coordinate their disciplinary practices, establishing uniform punishments for infractions so that workers couldn't play one master against another. If a worker was whipped on one plantation, the neighboring plantations should be notified, ensuring the worker's reputation followed them. The group discussed Brabant's proposal for an hour. Most agreed it had merit. They would meet again in 2 weeks to formalize the system. Reverend Caulfield listened to these conversations with growing unease. He understood the fear driving his congregation, but he also recognized that their proposed solutions would only increase tensions. Stricter discipline, coordinated punishments, mass sales of suspected troublemakers. These measures would create resentment and desperation, the very conditions that bred violence. But Caulfield said nothing. He nodded in agreement. He offered his church as a meeting place for future planning sessions. He prioritized maintaining his standing within the planter community over expressing moral qualms about their methods. This silence was its own form of complicity. Among the 32 people Caulfield owned was a woman named Dinah, who cooked and cleaned for the Reverend's household, while her husband, Isaac, worked Caulfield's cotton fields. Dinah had served the fellowship meal that Sunday, moving among the white families with practiced deference, hearing every word of their conversation. She told Isaac that evening what she had heard: the proposed surveillance system, the planned sales of outsiders, the tightening control mechanisms designed to prevent resistance. Isaac listened quietly. Then he asked Dinah a question she couldn't answer. What were they supposed to do? They couldn't flee. Dallas County had slave patrols on every road. They couldn't rebel openly. 32 people against all of Dallas County's white population was suicide. They couldn't even trust their own community completely. Some among the 32 were informers, people who traded information to Caulfield in exchange for minor privileges. Isaac and Dinah had no good options. They had only terrible choices, each one likely to end in death or worse. This was the machinery of the system working as designed. Not just physical coercion, but the elimination of alternative futures, the narrowing of possibilities until compliance seemed like the only survivable path. But even the most carefully designed machinery sometimes broke down. Isaac made his decision on October 20th. He waited until Reverend Caulfield was alone in the church sanctuary, preparing his sermon for the following Sunday. Isaac entered quietly, closing the door behind him. "Reverend," Isaac said, "I need to talk to you about the surveillance system." Caulfield looked up from his notes, surprised to see Isaac but not alarmed. Isaac was trustworthy, hard-working, never caused trouble. "What about it?" Caulfield asked. "It won't work," Isaac said simply. "It'll make everything worse." Caulfield set down his pen. "Isaac, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your affair." "It is my affair. It's my life you're planning. Your life belongs to God, and to me as his steward on earth." Isaac crossed the sanctuary slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "Do you know what happened to Mr. Wardlow? To Mr. Marshall? To Mr. Henderson and Mr. Price?" Caulfield's expression hardened. "Those are tragic mysteries that—" "They're not mysteries," Isaac interrupted. "They're consequences." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. In that brief span, Caulfield understood everything. The fear that had been abstract became specific, immediate, personal. "You're threatening me," Caulfield said quietly. "I'm warning you. The surveillance system, the coordinated punishments, the sales, if those things happen, more white men will die. Not by my hand specifically, but by someone's. Because you're forcing us to choose between certain suffering and uncertain violence. Some of us will choose violence." Caulfield stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I could have you whipped for this conversation. You could. And then what? I'll still know what I know. Others will still feel what they feel. You'll just have created another reason for someone to act. What would you do standing in Reverend Caulfield's position? Would you report Isaac's warning to the authorities, triggering investigations and reprisals that might prevent violence but would certainly cause suffering? Would you dismiss it as empty threats from someone powerless to follow through? Would you reconsider your support for the surveillance system, knowing that backing away might save your life, but would look like weakness to your congregation? Caulfield chose a fourth option. He did nothing. He never mentioned the conversation to anyone. He never reported Isaac. He never warned his fellow planters. But when they met 2 weeks later to formalize the surveillance system, Caulfield found reasons to absent himself. Church business in Montgomery, a sick relative who needed visiting, a missionary who required consultation. The surveillance system was implemented without Reverend Caulfield's participation. It lasted 6 months before the administrative burden became too complex and the participating planters abandoned it. Isaac lived another 48 years. Reverend Caulfield lived another 22. They never spoke of their conversation in the sanctuary. Neither man told anyone what had passed between them that October afternoon. But Caulfield sold his plantation in 1859 and moved to Georgia, leaving Alabama before the violence he had glimpsed came fully into focus. Some forms of complicity are built from action. Others are built from strategic inaction, from knowing what's happening and choosing not to interfere, from understanding that silence serves the powerful while leaving the powerless to their own devices. Caulfield survived because he chose silence. But that survival came with a cost that haunted him until his death in 1879, when he was buried in a Georgia churchyard far from the sanctuary, where Isaac had shown him exactly how fragile power really was. Howard Brabant's plantation sat on the Tombigbee River in Sumter County, 700 acres worked by 94 enslaved people. Brabant was a harsh master even by the standards of 1857, a man who believed that fear maintained order more effectively than incentive. He whipped workers for minor infractions. He separated families as punishment. He sold children to settle gambling debts. His workforce hated him with an intensity that bordered on religious conviction. In early November, Brabant received a letter from his brother in Mississippi requesting a loan to cover crop failures. The brother needed $5,000 within 2 weeks, or would lose his land. Brabant had the money, but was reluctant to part with it during uncertain times. The recent plantation disasters had made him cautious about liquidating assets. He decided to sell 10 people to raise the necessary funds, selecting them not based on productivity, but on which ones irritated him most. A field hand who worked too slowly. A woman who looked at him with insufficiently downcast eyes. A man whose children sang too loudly in the quarters. The sale was scheduled for November 9th. A trader from Tuscaloosa would arrive at 10 in the morning, inspect the merchandise, and depart with his purchases by noon. On November 8th, a woman named Patience approached Brabant while he was inspecting repairs to a storage shed. Patience was 56 years old, one of the oldest people on the plantation, respected in the quarters for her knowledge of herbs and healing. She had been at the Brabant plantation for 39 years, longer than Brabant himself had been alive. "Mr. Brabant," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you about tomorrow's sale." Brabant barely glanced at her. "Nothing to discuss. The matter's settled. The man you're selling, Samuel, he's my grandson. His wife just had a baby 3 weeks ago. Then she'll have a good reason to work hard so I don't sell her too." Patience stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There are other people you could sell. Younger people without families. People who cost you more in provisions than they produce. I'll sell whoever I damn well please. You'll regret this particular sale. Brabant stopped examining the shed and turned to face Patience fully. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. That man has family throughout this county. Friends on every plantation between here and Tuscaloosa. You sell him. You make an enemy of more people than you can count. Good. Let them know what happens to troublemakers. Patience held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. As you say, Mr. Brabant. She walked back toward the quarters. Brabant watched her go, feeling a prickle of unease that he immediately dismissed as irrational. An old woman couldn't hurt him. Networks of enslaved people were figments of abolitionist imagination, stories told to frighten children and naive northerners. The trader arrived on schedule at 10 the next morning. Brabant had the 10 people brought to the yard, hands bound, ready for inspection. The trader examined them with professional detachment, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking about health and skills. By 11:30, the transaction was complete. $5,000 in cash changed hands. The 10 people were loaded into a wagon. The trader snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled down the drive toward the river road. Samuel, Patience's grandson, looked back once at the plantation that had held his family for 2 generations. Then he turned forward and didn't look back again. Brabant counted his money in the study, satisfied with the morning's work. He would dispatch the funds to Mississippi that afternoon. His brother's gratitude would be expressed with future favors, connections, business opportunities. The transaction was profitable in multiple ways. At 3:15 that afternoon, Howard Brabant developed severe abdominal pain. By 4, he was vomiting uncontrollably. By 5, his skin had taken on a bluish tint, and his breathing had become labored. By 6, he was dead. The doctor who examined his body concluded that Brabant had likely eaten something contaminated. Food poisoning was common enough, particularly in November when meat sometimes spoiled before anyone noticed. The doctor didn't order an autopsy. He signed a death certificate listing acute gastric distress as the cause and collected his fee. Brabant's widow, Elizabeth, buried him 2 days later in the family plot. She inherited the plantation and the 94 remaining workers. Within a month, she had sold everything and moved to Mobile, unable to tolerate the isolation and fear of managing a plantation alone. Patience was purchased by a merchant family in Livingston who needed an experienced housekeeper. She worked in their household for 8 years before dying peacefully in her sleep in 1865, just months after emancipation was declared. She never told anyone that the herb she had mixed into Brabant's coffee on the morning of the sale was hemlock, gathered from the woods behind the quarters and prepared using knowledge passed down from her grandmother who had learned it in Africa. She never mentioned that the dosage had been calculated precisely to avoid immediate symptoms, giving her time to be visible in the quarters when Brabant began showing distress. She never said anything about revenge or justice or the networks that connected enslaved people across county lines, the informal systems of communication and mutual aid that white people dismissed as impossible. She simply lived her remaining years quietly, and when she died, she was buried in a cemetery for freed people in Livingston with a marker that read, Patience Freeman, born 1801, died 1865, she endured. By late November of 1857, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 7 plantation families across 6 Alabama counties had been destroyed or displaced since August. The Wardlows of Wilcox County, Montgomery disappeared. Catherine fled. The Marshals of Wilcox County. Edward disappeared. Property sold. The Hendersons of Marengo County. Jeremiah and both sons dead. Plantation sold. The Prices of Greene County. Nathaniel disappeared. Amanda sold the property. The Caulfields of Dallas County. Thomas relocated to Georgia. The Brabants of Sumter County. Howard dead. Elizabeth relocated to Mobile. 7 families. 5 counties. 4 months. The Montgomery Advertiser published an editorial on November 23rd, calling for a coordinated investigation across county lines. The writer suggested that a gang of abolitionists might be operating in the region, targeting prominent planters to destabilize the institution of slavery. The theory gained traction among white Alabamians desperate for an explanation that preserved their worldview. Abolitionist conspiracy was frightening but comprehensible. It meant the threat came from outside, from dangerous radicals who could be identified and eliminated. It meant the system itself wasn't failing. The alternative, that enslaved people might be capable of organized, strategic resistance, was literally unthinkable to most white Southerners. Their entire society rested on the assumption that bondspeople were incapable of such sophisticated action, that any violence they committed would be impulsive and easily suppressed. This assumption was their fatal weakness. Governor John Winston called for a special session of the legislature to address the crisis. Lawmakers debated emergency measures, increased funding for slave patrols, harsher penalties for harboring fugitives, mandatory registration of all enslaved people who moved between counties. But none of these measures addressed the actual problem, because legislators refused to acknowledge what the actual problem was. In the quarters of Alabama's plantations, a different conversation was happening. News traveled through kinship networks, church gatherings, market days, and the informal channels that had always existed beneath white surveillance. Stories were shared carefully, details preserved, names remembered. Montgomery Wardlow, Edward Marshall, Jeremiah Henderson, Nathaniel Price, Howard Brabant. The list grew in communal memory, becoming a catalog of consequences, proof that the powerful could be made to pay for their cruelty. But the enslaved people who heard these stories also understood the danger. Every plantation owner who died or fled meant investigations, increased surveillance, harsher discipline for those who remained. Freedom wasn't coming. Not yet. Maybe not in their lifetimes. But they could make certain white people afraid, could create cracks in the facade of total control, could demonstrate that the system had vulnerabilities. That had to be enough. The 7th plantation to fall was the Ashford Estate in Perry County, a modest property of 320 acres worked by 41 enslaved people. Jonathan Ashford was a new planter, only 28 years old, who had inherited the land from an uncle in 1856. He was trying to establish himself among the county's established families, eager to prove he could manage labor and land as competently as men twice his age. Jonathan had read about the disasters in neighboring counties with growing anxiety. By December of 1857, he had convinced himself that strict discipline would prevent whatever had happened to the other planters from happening to him. He implemented a system of comprehensive surveillance, requiring workers to report on each other, rewarding informants with extra rations. This strategy backfired catastrophically. The surveillance system created deep divisions within the enslaved community at Ashford Plantation. Some cooperated with Jonathan, providing reports that led to whippings and reduced privileges for others. These informants believed they were protecting themselves, buying safety through compliance. Others refused to participate. They formed a counter-network, sharing information about who could be trusted and who couldn't to quietly isolating the informants from community support. The man who killed Jonathan Ashford was named Benjamin. He was 19 years old, born on the plantation, son of two people who had been sold away when he was 6. Benjamin had been raised by an elderly woman who taught him to read by scratching letters in the dirt with a stick. He was quiet, observant, and capable of holding grudges with remarkable patience. Benjamin had been whipped twice because of information provided by an informant named Daniel. The whippings left scars across his back and a determination to make Jonathan Ashford understand the cost of his surveillance system. On December 7th, Benjamin set fire to a storage barn on the far side of the plantation. The barn contained equipment, but no livestock, chosen specifically because the fire would demand attention without causing mass death. When the alarm was raised, Jonathan and every available worker ran toward the flames. Benjamin remained behind, waiting near the main house. Jonathan had developed a habit of returning to the house after emergencies to record events in a journal he kept for insurance purposes. Benjamin knew this because he had watched Jonathan do it 3 times in the past 2 months. Jonathan returned at 9:35 p.m., soot-stained and exhausted. He entered through the back door, heading for his study. Benjamin was waiting in the hallway with a fireplace poker. The first blow stunned Jonathan. The second killed him. Benjamin dragged the body to the study and arranged it to suggest Jonathan had fallen and struck his head on the desk's corner during the excitement of the fire. Then Benjamin walked calmly out of the house and joined the workers still fighting the barn fire, his clothes no more disheveled than anyone else's. Jonathan's wife Rebecca found him at 10:47 p.m. The doctor who examined the body noted significant head trauma consistent with a fall. The coroner ruled the death accidental, a tragedy compounded by the stress of the evening's fire. The plantation sold at auction in February of 1858. Rebecca relocated to Montgomery to live with her parents. The 41 enslaved people were dispersed. Benjamin was purchased by a cotton merchant in Selma who needed warehouse workers. He lived another 56 years, dying in 1913 at age 75. His grandchildren remembered him as a quiet man who never spoke about his years in bondage, but who always smiled when he heard news of a plantation going bankrupt or a former master dying poor. Nobody ever discovered what he had done to Jonathan Ashford. Nobody ever asked. In January of 1858, a merchant named Silas Webb was sorting through items purchased at the Ashford estate auction when he discovered a leather-bound ledger in a crate of office supplies. The ledger belonged to Jonathan Ashford and contained meticulous records of every aspect of plantation operations for the previous 18 months. Webb was not particularly interested in farming. He bought the crate for the furniture it contained, a desk and chair that he planned to resell. But the ledger caught his attention because of an odd notation on the final page, written in Ashford's hand just 2 days before his death. December 5th, 1857. The surveillance system has revealed 6 informants among the 41. Rewards distributed accordingly. 3 workers punished for refusing cooperation. System functioning as designed. However, I note increased tension in quarters. Recommend expansion of patrol schedule and reduction of privileges to discourage collaboration. The troubles in neighboring counties cannot be attributed to negligence alone. There is organization where we have assumed only chaos. Webb read the entry twice, recognizing something significant in Ashford's final observation. Organization where we have assumed only chaos. The phrase suggested Ashford had been close to understanding what was happening across Alabama's plantation belt, had been on the verge of recognizing a pattern that contradicted everything white Southerners believed about enslaved people's capacities. Webb brought the ledger to the county sheriff, a man named Augustus Clay, who had been trying unsuccessfully to coordinate investigations across county lines. Clay read Ashford's entry and immediately recognized its implications. If Ashford was right, if there was organization, coordination, communication between enslaved populations, then every assumption underlying the region's security had been wrong. Slave patrols watched roads and rivers, preventing individual escapes. But they weren't designed to detect or prevent communication networks that operated through legal channels. Markets, church gatherings, hired out workers who moved between plantations. Clay began a new investigation. He requested records from all 7 affected plantations, looking for commonalities. He interviewed overseers, reviewed hiring practices, examined travel permits issued to enslaved people who had moved between properties. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Clay's findings were documented in a report submitted to Governor Winston on March 2, 1858. The report has been lost to history, but fragments survive in contemporary correspondence. Evidence suggests sophisticated communication network operating beneath plantation supervision. Names appear across multiple properties in roles that facilitated information transfer. Domestic workers, skilled trades, hired labor, impossible to determine full scope due to unwillingness of informants to speak candidly. Recommend comprehensive registration system tracking all enslaved persons who move between counties. The recommendation was never implemented. The administrative burden would have been immense, and plantation owners resisted any system that might restrict their ability to hire out skilled workers. The report was filed and forgotten as Alabama moved toward larger crises that would culminate in secession and war. But Clay's investigation had one immediate effect. It terrified white Alabamians. If enslaved people could organize, could communicate, could plan coordinated actions across county lines, then the entire social order was more fragile than anyone had admitted. The violence of 1857 wasn't random misfortune. It was strategic, purposeful, and potentially just the beginning. Between February and April of 1858, 43 plantation families sold their properties in the 6-county region affected by the previous year's violence. Some relocated to the Mississippi Delta. Others moved to Georgia or South Carolina. A few abandoned plantation agriculture entirely, investing their capital in urban businesses or Western land speculation. The exodus created a buyer's market. Plantation prices dropped by 30 to 40%. Investors from Mobile and Montgomery purchased the properties at discount rates, consolidating holdings into larger estates managed by hired overseers rather than resident owners. This consolidation changed the dynamics of power in Alabama's Black Belt. Absentee ownership meant less daily supervision, more autonomy for overseers who ran operations without constant owner scrutiny. It also meant larger enslaved populations concentrated on fewer properties, creating communities of 200 or 300 people rather than the smaller groups of 50 to 100 that had been typical. These larger communities developed more complex social structures. Leadership emerged organically. Knowledge networks became more sophisticated. Resistance strategies evolved from individual acts to collective planning. The white departure of 1858 was intended to reduce risk. In practice, it created conditions that would make the 1860s even more volatile. On April 19, 1858, the last of the original 7 plantation houses burned to the ground. The structure had been empty for 3 months, purchased at auction by a speculator who planned to renovate and resell. Nobody was home when the fire started at 2:17 a.m. Nobody called for help until flames were visible from the river road. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was fully engulfed. The fire burned hot enough to crack the foundation stones and melt the window glass into rivulets that ran down charred brick like frozen tears. Investigators found no evidence of arson. The house had likely been struck by lightning during a spring storm, they concluded. Dry wood and abandoned structure plus electrical discharge equaled predictable result. But in the quarters of surrounding plantations, a different story circulated. People spoke of 7 fires for 7 houses, of justice that burned slow but burned clean, of a cycle completed and a message sent. The truth was simpler and more complicated. The fire was accident, not arson, but the interpretation, the meaning enslaved people assigned to it, was deliberate and strategic. They chose to see pattern and purpose because pattern and purpose were weapons that white surveillance couldn't confiscate. If plantation owners believed that enslaved people were coordinating, communicating, planning, then white fear became a tool that could be wielded without ever raising a hand. The threat of organization was as powerful as organization itself. This was the lesson of 1857. Power wasn't just physical coercion. Power was also psychological, the ability to make the powerful afraid, to create uncertainty where certainty had been, to demonstrate that control was always conditional and never absolute. 7 plantation owners had died or disappeared. 7 families had fled. 7 properties had changed hands under distress, and across Alabama's Black Belt, enslaved people watched and learned and remembered. The fire on April 19th was an accident, but it was also a punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written in blood and fear and strategic silence. Your power has limits, and we know where they are. By summer of 1858, the violence that had consumed Alabama's plantation belt for nearly a year had simply stopped. No more disappearances, no more suspicious deaths, no more families fleeing in panic. The silence was almost more disturbing than the violence had been. Sheriff Augustus Clay continued investigating through 1859, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing workers who claimed ignorance, examining records that revealed nothing conclusive. His final report, submitted in January of 1860, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic frustration. Despite extensive investigation, this office has been unable to establish definitive proof of coordinated action among the enslaved population. Circumstantial evidence suggests possibility of communication networks, but no informant has provided testimony sufficient to support prosecution. Recommend continued vigilance and enhanced surveillance, but acknowledge limitations of current enforcement mechanisms. Translation: we know something happened. We suspect who was responsible. We can't prove anything. The Confederate States of America formed in 1861. Alabama seceded on January 11th. The Civil War began in April. The plantation belt that had been convulsed by mysterious violence in 1857 became a theater for much larger conflicts. Tens of thousands of enslaved men fled to Union lines when federal troops entered Alabama in 1863. They joined the Union Army, worked as scouts and laborers, provided intelligence about Southern positions and movements. The communication networks that white authorities had suspected but never confirmed became obvious when enslaved people could demonstrate their sophistication openly. Many of those who fled had been part of the events of 1857, either as actors or witnesses. They carried their knowledge north, shared their stories with federal officers, contributed to the dismantling of the system that had oppressed them. But they rarely spoke about the specific deaths and disappearances. Those details remained protected, held within communities that understood the value of strategic silence even in freedom. Thomas, the man who killed Montgomery Wardlow, lived until 1903. He was 72 years old when he died in Chicago, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery. He had worked as a blacksmith for 40 years after emancipation, earned enough to buy a house, participated in his church and neighborhood associations. He never told anyone what he had done in August of 1857. The knowledge died with him, buried in a Chicago cemetery far from the Alabama River bluff, where Montgomery Wardlow's plantation house still stood, renovated and occupied by new owners who knew nothing of its history. Rachel, who poisoned the Henderson family, died in Demopolis in 1860 at age 37. Her daughter Sarah survived until 1928, living long enough to see women get the vote. Sarah sometimes told her own children about the island where Grandma worked, but she never mentioned what had happened there, never spoke of fires and poison and 3 bodies arranged to look like suicide. Elijah, who killed Nathaniel Price, died in Tuscaloosa in 1881. His funeral was attended by 70 people, black and white, who praised his craftsmanship and integrity. The coffin he was buried in was made by his grandson, using techniques Elijah had taught him. Nobody at the funeral knew that Elijah had once used those same techniques to build a coffin for a man he murdered. Isaac, who warned Reverend Caulfield about consequences, lived in Dallas County until 1905. He became a landowner during Reconstruction, purchasing 40 acres of farmland that he worked with his children and grandchildren. He was known as a quiet man who went to church every Sunday and never caused trouble. The confrontation in the sanctuary stayed locked inside him until the day he died, a secret he considered too dangerous to share even after the system that had created it was gone. Patience, who poisoned Howard Brabant, died in 1865, just months after emancipation. She was buried in Livingston with a marker that identified her as She Endured. Her knowledge of herbs and healing died with her. The traditions she had inherited from Africa and adapted to survival in Alabama extinguished by time and silence. Benjamin, who killed Jonathan Ashford, died in Selma in 1913. He lived to see automobiles and electric lights and the beginning of what people were calling the modern age. He told his grandchildren stories about slavery, carefully edited versions that emphasized endurance and community rather than the violence he had committed. The fireplace poker he used to kill Ashford had been melted down and reforged into nails during the war. The nails helped build a church that still stands in Selma today. 7 people killed or contributed to killing 7 plantation owners. All of them lived long enough to die free. None of them were ever prosecuted. None of them ever confessed publicly. None of them received recognition or condemnation for what they had done. Justice, such as it was, came not from courts or tribunals, but from the simple fact of survival, of outliving the system that had tried to crush them, of creating families and communities and futures that slavery had attempted to deny. This was the reckoning, not punishment or vindication, but the stubborn continuance of life against all attempts to extinguish it. The old woman who told me the story was 93 years old, sitting on a porch in Selma in the summer of 1976. She was Benjamin's granddaughter, though she didn't tell me that until much later. She said her grandmother had whispered things to her when she was young, fragments of stories about a time when white families fled Alabama in fear, when plantation houses stood empty, when the powerful learned that their power had limits. Did it really happen the way the stories say? I asked. She smiled. Does it matter? What matters is that we remember it happened, that we know our people fought back, even when fighting back meant hiding what they'd done for the rest of their lives. That's the victory right there, survival and memory. The descendants of those 7 plantation families are still in Alabama some of them. They live in Birmingham and Montgomery, practice law and medicine, run businesses, and serve in government. Most have no idea what their ancestors experienced in 1857, why their families suddenly relocated, what violence drove them from land they'd owned for generations. The descendants of the enslaved people who killed them are also still in Alabama. They live in Selma and Tuscaloosa, work in factories and schools, raise children and grandchildren who carry forward names and stories and silences. Sometimes these descendants meet without knowing their connection, at grocery stores, in courtrooms, on street corners where history presses close but remains invisible. They shake hands, conduct business, pass on sidewalks, unaware that their grandparents' were locked in a struggle that shaped everything that came after. The plantation houses where it all happened are mostly gone now. Some burned, some were demolished. A few remain as museums or private homes, their histories sanitized and simplified, presented as tales of agricultural innovation or architectural significance. But on certain nights in Alabama's Black Belt, old people still tell stories about the year the masters ran. About 7 families who learned that cruelty had consequences. About violence that was never solved because the people who knew the truth understood that some secrets are more powerful when kept. The stories may not be literally true in every detail. Memory distorts, legend embellishes, time obscures. But the stories are true in the way that matters most. They remember that resistance happened, that the enslaved fought back, that the system wasn't absolute or eternal, that courage sometimes meant silence, and survival meant carrying unbearable knowledge to the grave. 7 families fled Alabama in 1857 and 58. 7 plantation owners died or disappeared. 7 properties changed hands under circumstances that were never fully explained. And somewhere in the dark soil of the Alabama River Basin, secrets are still buried, waiting for a flood or an excavation or a confession to bring them into light. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.